Okay, new chapter again. Let's call this 15, part 1. We're going to cover monopoly, and monopoly is more or less the unideal. If you think back to our spectrum analogy, monopoly was on the far side away from perfect competition. You're going to get your highest prices and your lowest quantities. We're going to highlight the difference between these two market structures in this presentation. In order to understand why a monopoly is able to do this, though, we're going to have to spend just a little bit of time talking about barriers to entry. Barriers to entry are really the secret to maintaining monopoly power. The monopolist is essentially a price maker. They choose where they want to be on the demand curve. Now that's essentially the same as a mono-comp firm. What I want you to realize is the difference between monopoly and a mono-comp firm is really just that a monopolist has no fear of substitutes. So there's not much limitation on them at all. They're generally going to have a much larger market than a mono-comp firm. And since there's no substitutes, they're going to have a much steeper demand curve, and of course, a steeper marginal revenue curve. So what does this really mean for the monopolist? It means profits. They're going to be able to make a lot more profit than a mono-comp firm generally. And for society, it means that you're going to pay higher prices and there's going to be less quantity available. I want to model that for you in the next coming slides. Okay, let's go ahead and walk ourselves through a little thought experiment. Let's assume that we have 100 perfectly competitive firms, and we're going to merge them all into one. Essentially, we're going to make a monopoly. But that monopolist doesn't really have any advantages from costs or anything else. The only thing they have going for them is that they collectively make a decision as one, essentially like a cartel. When we look at the way that that one firm would behave in comparison to what we would expect the 100 independent firms to do, you can isolate what's going on with market power or price-making power. So let's go ahead and start out with our perfectly competitive scenario. Under perfect competition, we knew that those firms always ended up producing a quantity that had a price equal to marginal cost. The only spot that that's true on this graph is right here. At this spot, you are going to end up with Q for the competitive firm. This is the price that a competitive firm would end up charging. We're going to get ourselves to the minimum of the ATC, which happens to be flat here based on our assumptions, and P is equal to MC at that Q. We're going to compare that now to what would happen if you had a monopolist. If you had a monopolist, they're immediately going to start recognizing that as they provide more or less quantity, it influences the price that they're going to be able to sell it all at. They are going to look at this and say, well, I am going to want to go where MR equals MC. Keep in mind, for imperfectly competitive firms, price and marginal revenue are very rarely the same thing. MR equals MC here. This quantity is the monopoly quantity, and of course, it is going to sell at a higher price. So the natural outcome for a monopolist, even if nothing changes except for the fact that there's one instead of many, is that you are going to restrict quantity, and as you restrict quantity, you are going to raise price. The consequences of this are fairly obvious. One, you have a whole lot of quantity that does not get sold. So monopolists and any firm with market power is generally going to generate some deadweight loss. You lose some transactions. Now they don't mind this because the producer is grabbing this box here as additional producer surplus. It's profit essentially. That of course came out of what was originally the consumer surplus triangle. So a monopolist or any other imperfectly competitive firm, by restricting quantity and raising prices, is going to capture part of consumer surplus and turn it into profits. The downside is that they are going to cause some deadweight loss. This is why people get concerned about less and less competitive markets. Growing deadweight loss represents inefficiency within those markets. You might be able to stomach the fact that consumer surplus was getting gobbled up as profits because it was still efficient, right? No one paid for products they weren't willing to pay for. But the deadweight loss is clearly and unequivocally a bad thing. In summary, I just want to make sure that it's really clear. Imperfectly competitive firms, monopolists being the worst of the bunch, are always going to restrict quantity and they're going to drive up prices. And what this means in terms of the real big picture is that productive efficiency is generally going to suffer. Allocative efficiency is certainly going to suffer because the last unit that they create is always going to have a higher marginal benefit for consumers, at least, than the marginal cost of the firms creating it. But the monopolist is never really going to worry too much about that because they are, of course, maximizing their profits when they choose to produce Q star. Q star for them is where their marginal benefit, MR, is equal to MC. They're not concerned about the fact that society still values it more than the costs. So it appears that a monopolist is somewhat at odds with society regarding efficiency. And this has a long tradition going all the way back into at least Veblen. Veblen basically said that every firm has an interest in destroying competition so that they can actually maximize profits. And monopoly power suggests that those really nice outcomes go by the wayside. You're going to not get minimum prices any longer. You're going to get a maximum price. And you are not going to get a maximum quantity. You're going to get a minimum quantity. So in terms of our spectrum from perfect competition to monopoly, we learned that this max P and minimum Q was a result of monopoly power. It's the antithesis of our ideal on the perfectly competitive side.